Analysis is a competitive analysis tool first used by Royal Dutch Shell in the 1960s. In both business and the military, the concept of scenario analysis is to assemble a menu of alternative futures. Think of these alternative futures as stories about the future. The word itself, scenario, comes from the theater, which is an outline of the plot of a dramatic or literary work and which includes information about its characters and its scenes. Likewise, analysis is a tool that is, in essence, a story with a plot and with characters. These scenarios, they're not blind guesses. They're the product of a venerable tradition of counterfactual history. It's a technique of asking, what if, with respect to key drivers that impact us or our organization. One way of thinking about scenario analysis is to consider a movie that was made based on the classic board game Clue. Clue is a murder mystery board game that was created in England in 1948. It was first sold in the U.S. by Parker Brothers under the name of Clue in 1949. Players attempt to solve the mystery of who killed Mr. Boddy, B-O-D-D-Y. The game was made into a 1985 comedic motion picture. And in an unusual twist, 3 versions of the film with 3 different endings were made, and they were shown in different theaters around the country. And that's the point. The film had 3 equally plausible endings. Each of the endings, or scenarios, incorporated the same elements or clues, but yielded different results. And this is what we do in scenario analysis. Scenario analysis requires us to consider the elements we develop as part of our investigation process and to assemble them into equally plausible stories about the future. In the original method of scenario analysis, theories about the future would be generated by keen-minded experts. Again, not just one future, but several futures. It's really scenarios analysis. Scenarios are indeed stories about the future, and these stories help to clarify for us the choices available. Peter Schwartz is a futurist who did his early work in scenario analysis at Stanford Research Institute in the 1970s. He then became a scenario analyst for Royal Dutch Shell Corporation in the 1980s. Schwartz said this about the utility of scenarios. They form a method for articulating the different pathways that might exist for you tomorrow and finding your appropriate movements down each of those possible paths. Scenario planning is about making choices today with an understanding of how they might turn out. Most of us are already familiar with the idea of scenario planning. We may actually have engaged in it at some point. We may know it by a different name: training, rehearsal, standard operating procedure, or contingency plan. In essence, the construction of scenarios allow us to rehearse the future. Many organizations rehearse the future, particularly those organizations tasked with critical missions: the Army, Navy, and Air Force, the police, fire departments, early responders of every stripe. All of them rehearse the future. Military basic training, that's the application of scenario rehearsal. The nation's more elite troops constantly rehearse various likely scenarios, some of them highly unlikely. Delta Force, the United States Anti-Terrorist Response Unit, and the Navy's SEAL Team 6 or DEVGRU do nothing but rehearse for the future in every scenario imaginable. In sports, too, teams rehearse the future. In fact, football is a complex laboratory for scenario analysis. Players are taught to read opposing formations and to react to them within seconds. Teams relentlessly practice situational responses. If situation A arises, then my opponent has certain options open to it. Consequently, my team practices responses X, Y, and Z. One of the most important aspects of effective scenario analysis is that the response is rehearsed under conditions that closely resemble the actual projected event. Sports teams practice scenario responses under game-like conditions. Elite commandos train under hyper-realistic conditions, including the use of live ammunition in exercises. My own experience with scenario analysis, planning, and response was with NATO during the Cold War in NATO tactical evaluation exercises. These exercises were conducted under conditions as realistic and severe as training limits would allow. These could be considered rehearsals of the future, rehearsing the possibilities of a massive Soviet attack across the German border. Several NATO countries provided officers as referees: Germans, Belgians, British. Our unit, a Hawk missile battalion, would inaugurate an exercise, deploying as it would during a Soviet attack. The sites and scenarios would vary, but the procedures were invariably the same as we responded to the various scripts given to us over a period of days. Action, and then response. Action, and then response. Putting stress on the unit, imposing casualties, pushing it hard, even harder, until eventually the unit fails. In business, too, war games are used to simulate crisis decision-making in likely scenarios involving competitors. These exercises have the advantage of moving senior management out of the structured corporate board meeting, where certain options might be taboo for discussion. Those options can then be surfaced in the war games. This is where conventional thinking and the official party line can be safely challenged. In all of these examples, the linking thread is rehearsal. Said Peter Schwartz, "You run through the simulated events as if you were already living them. You train yourself to recognize which drama is unfolding. That helps you avoid unpleasant surprises and then know how to act." Royal Dutch Shell pioneered and led the use of scenario planning in the business world. At the time, this was quite bold and it was unconventional. But the origins of this approach arose from the early work of nuclear strategy theorist Herman Kahn. Herman Kahn can be called the father of scenario analysis. Kahn became famous in developing his scenarios about nuclear war when he worked for the Rand Corporation in the 1950s, thinking about the unthinkable. At the time, he was roundly criticized for actually thinking logically about a future in which nuclear weapons could be used. Kahn served as an uncooperative model for the title character in the Stanley Kubrick film Dr. Strangelove. His only transgression, if you can call it that, was not ducking the issue of nuclear war. Instead, he thought long and hard about how various futures might play out. At Shell in the late 1960s, scenario planning emerged for a very specific reason. Pierre Wack introduced scenario planning into Shell. His premise was that some things are predictable. It is necessary to assume that some things are predictable. If the future, after all, is 100% unknowable, then planning is useless. And so scenarios were introduced as a way to plan without having to predict things that everyone knew were unpredictable. It was a mid-range solution. The task, as Wack saw it, was to separate what is predictable from what is fundamentally uncertain. Now, the predictable elements are called predeterminates. The predeterminates would appear in each scenario in the same predictable way. The uncertainties, however, would interact and play out in different ways as the horizon of the future extended. With this as the groundwork, let's look at the objectives of scenario planning and then at one example of the step-by-step process. Scenario planning has three basic objectives. The first objective is to generate projects and decisions that are more robust under a variety of different futures. The notion of more robust projects and decisions is truly elegant. Rather than measure a proposal against the best possible scenario, it's measured against all the scenarios that emerge from the process. Projects are crafted to perform to minimum expectations under all the scenarios. A scenario-based culture is suffused throughout an organization so that projects and decisions are weighed against several possible futures instead of the future that may be preferred. The second objective is to improve the quality of our thinking about the future. Rather than a unidimensional, linear thought process that yields a single official future, scenario planning stretches our minds. It forces us to consider possibilities otherwise dismissed, perhaps dismissed prematurely. The third objective is to deepen and enrich the way people interpret the information around them, which becomes notably and qualitatively different than the thinking of others. One Shell executive summarized it this way: At Shell, scenarios are designed to think the unthinkable and to challenge conventional wisdom. If one looks at the early scenarios developed at Shell, you can see clearly that they not only told stories about the future, but that they also identified risks, established milestones, or indicators to monitor, and in the end, sometimes led to actual management action. Obviously, an organization like Shell devotes tremendous resources to its scenarios. It is a complex process, but we can make use of a similar process in our personal decision-making. Here's the basic process for scenario planning. It involves asking and answering a series of questions. First, identify the focal issue or decision. What is it that you already do and why? What is it that you want to do? This issue is generated by the mission